Imagine crossing an ocean so vast your map just calls it, "Here be monsters." No GPS, no backup plan, and the snacks? Mostly salted fish and hardtack so solid you could break a tooth in a friendship over it. We love to romanticize the world's greatest explorers, brave men staring into the unknown, compass in hand, destiny in their eyes. Names like Columbus, Magellan, da Gama, and Marco Polo echo through textbooks like action heroes of the high seas. But behind the golden legends were some truly messy truths. Miscalculations, mutinies, questionable hygiene, and, more than a few, oops, wrong continent moments. Before you picture a grand voyage with waving flags and exotic spices, maybe ask yourself, what did it really feel like to spend months at sea with no deodorant, eating weevils for breakfast, and hoping the guy navigating wasn't just winging it? If that mental image didn't ruin the childhood diorama you made of the Santa Maria, you're in the right place. So before you get too cozy in your climate-controlled room with your filtered water and non-scurvy teeth, do me a favor. Like this video, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, if you had to set sail with one historical explorer, who would it be and why would you regret it instantly? Dim the lights, sit back, and prepare to sail into the lesser-known, occasionally ridiculous, and often uncomfortable reality behind the so-called heroes who discovered the world, sometimes by accident. Let's dive in. You stand at the edge of Lisbon's bustling harbor. The year is 1500, and the air tastes of salt, dreams, and something else, something unspoken. The wooden docks creak beneath your feet as sailors haul crates of exotic spices that will soon grace the tables of Europe's elite. Your history teachers never told you this part of the story. That knot in your stomach? It's the first hint that the grand tales of exploration you've cherished might be beautiful illusions, carefully crafted myths that have shaped how you see the world. The ship before you has just returned from what they're calling the New World. New to whom, you wonder? The weathered captain will soon be celebrated in the royal court, his name etched into marble monuments. But the real architects of his journey, the navigators, the translators, the indigenous guides, will fade into the shadows of history. You've always pictured explorers as lone heroes, squinting bravely toward distant horizons. But here's the truth that changes everything. They were never alone, and often, they weren't even first. Long before Columbus convinced Queen Isabella to fund his voyage, African sailors had mastered the Atlantic's temperamental currents. While European ships hugged coastlines, Pacific Islanders were reading the stars like a cosmic map, traversing distances that would make any European captain's knees quake. The spices you smell on the harbor breeze, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, traveled along trade routes established centuries before Europeans claimed to discover them. These weren't uncharted territories. They were someone else's home, someone else's map, someone else's story. As you move closer to the arriving ships, you notice how the sailors' tales grow taller with each retelling. The monsters get fiercer, the gold more plentiful, the savages more exotic. It's not just exploration you're witnessing, it's theater, propaganda, the careful construction of empire. You watch a cartographer hunched over his desk in a tavern near the docks. With each stroke of his quill, he doesn't just draw coastlines, he claims them. Forests become timber, rivers become transportation routes, sacred mountains become mining opportunities. The map isn't a reflection of the world, it's a blueprint for taking it. This moment in Lisbon is just the beginning of your journey to uncover what your textbooks never revealed. The age of exploration wasn't simply about brave men in tiny ships. It was about power. Who gets to name things? Who gets remembered? Whose stories survive? You feel a shift in your understanding, like the ground moving beneath your feet. What if everything you thought you knew about how the world was discovered was just one perspective? The perspective of those who held the pens, controlled the printing presses, and commissioned the paintings. The salty air suddenly feels heavier as this realization settles on your shoulders. You're about to step into a different story of exploration, not the one of conquering heroes, but of complex human interactions, cultural collisions, and buried truths that deserve to be unearthed. This journey won't be comfortable. It will challenge cherished myths and beloved heroes. But as you leave the Lisbon harbor behind, you're ready to explore not just how the world was mapped, but how those maps redrew history itself, and perhaps, in some small way, redrew you. Your first stop, takes you to the misty shores of the Polynesian Islands, where navigation was an art form long before the first European sail appeared on the horizon. Here, you're about to witness a different kind of exploration altogether. The morning light breaks gently over the Pacific as you stand on a wooden canoe that seems impossibly small for the vast ocean surrounding you. Your companion, a Polynesian navigator, points not to any instrument, but to the stars fading with dawn, the patterns of waves, even the flight of certain birds. How can you possibly know where we are, you ask, feeling the gentle rock of the ocean beneath you? The navigator smiles, pointing to the water itself. The ocean is not a barrier, he tells you. It's a road that connects all islands. Without compass, without sextant, without any of the tools European explorers would later claim made their journeys possible, Polynesian sailors had been navigating thousands of miles of open ocean for centuries. Their vessels, you notice, are engineering marvels. Double-hulled canoes designed for stability and speed. You run your fingers along the smooth wood, feeling the generations of knowledge embedded in its construction. Each knot, each lashing, each curve of the hull represents centuries of accumulated wisdom, passed from master to apprentice through chance, stories, and hands-on training. These weren't aimless wanderers hoping to stumble upon land. They were methodical explorers with sophisticated understanding of celestial navigation, weather patterns, and ocean currents. By the time Captain Cook arrived in the late 1700s, claiming to discover these islands, they had been found, settled, and connected through complex trading networks for nearly 3,000 years. The sweet scent of tropical flowers drifts across the water, as your Polynesian guide explains how navigators could feel the presence of islands beyond the horizon by reading subtle changes in wave patterns, cloud formations, and even the reflections of distant land on the underside of clouds. We don't conquer the ocean, he tells you, his voice gentle but firm. We listen to it. We learn its language. This philosophy of exploration, based on harmony rather than domination, stands in stark contrast to the European approach you'll witness in the centuries to come. As the sun climbs higher, warming your skin, you realize how profoundly this challenges the narrative you've been taught. These weren't primitive people waiting to be discovered. These were sophisticated explorers with technologies perfectly adapted to their environment. When European ships eventually appeared on these horizons, they weren't bringing civilization to an isolated people. They were merely joining an ancient conversation about how humans move across the face of the earth, a conversation that had been going on long before their sails appeared. The canoe glides effortlessly through the water as your guide points out a flock of birds on the horizon. A sign, he explains, that land is near. You feel a profound sense of humility. How many other forms of knowledge, you wonder, have been dismissed simply because they didn't resemble European understandings of science? As you step onto the shore of a lush island, feet sinking into warm sand, you can't help but imagine how these same beaches would appear to European eyes centuries later. They would describe these places as untouched, virgin territory, paradise found, never acknowledging the generations who had carefully tended these landscapes, named every cove and peak, and developed sustainable relationships with these environments. Your journey continues, sweeping you forward in time to the legendary Silk Road, where cultures converged long before the age of exploration was even a concept in European minds. The dry air of Central Asia fills your lungs as you join a caravan making its way across terrain that alternates between breathtaking and brutal. The sun beats down mercilessly as you travel with merchants carrying silk, spices, and ideas between east and west. Your fellow travelers speak a dozen languages, practice different faiths, and have navigated these routes for generations. This wasn't exploration in the way your textbooks described it. This was connection, a complex network of trade that linked disparate civilizations. You've been taught about Marco Polo as if he unveiled a mysterious East to an unaware Europe. But as you stop at a bustling caravanserai for the night, the multicultural nature of this ancient trading network tells a different story. Marco Polo wasn't revealing unknown worlds. He was merely one traveler on well-established roads. The evening brings relief from the heat as you gather around fires with traders who share stories of distant cities. A Persian merchant describes the libraries of Baghdad with their thousands of scrolls. A Chinese silk trader speaks of mechanical clocks and printing presses. You realize that knowledge flowed along these routes just as surely as goods. Inside the stone walls of the caravanserai, you watch as merchants carefully record their transactions in bound ledgers. These weren't just traders, they were diplomats, linguists, geographers, each one carrying detailed mental maps of territories that European cartographers wouldn't document for centuries. The aroma of unfamiliar spices fills the air as dinner is prepared. You're offered a steaming bowl of something fragrant and hearty, sustenance for tomorrow's journey. The man who hands it to you has traveled from Kashmir to Cairo and back again multiple times. His knowledge of languages, cultures, and geography surpasses that of any European explorer you've read about. How do you find your way? You ask him, thinking of the featureless desert you crossed today. He laughs gently, pointing to the stars emerging in the twilight sky. The desert is never empty to those who know how to read it, he says. Every dune has a name, every rocky outcrop is a landmark. As night falls completely, bringing a chill to the air that makes you pull your cloak tighter, you contemplate how the very concept of discovery depends entirely on whose knowledge counts. These traders weren't documenting their journeys for royal patrons or seeking fame. They were simply living in a connected world that Europe would later claim to have opened. The silk trader unrolls a rough map drawn on parchment, pointing to routes that connect China to the Mediterranean. This map, created by people whose names history would never record, was more accurate than anything that would exist in Europe for hundreds of years. Morning arrives with the calls of merchants preparing to depart. As you continue your journey, the taste of dust on your lips and the creak of camel saddles creating a rhythmic soundtrack, you can't help but wonder, how might history be different if we acknowledge that exploration was rarely about finding the unknown, but about who got to write the story afterward? Your journey sweeps you forward in time again, and you find yourself standing on the deck of a Spanish ship in 1492, watching as Christopher Columbus paces nervously. The winds fill the sails as the crew mutters anxiously about sailing into oblivion. But you know something they don't. They're not heading into the unknown. The Atlantic spray cools your face as you contemplate what Columbus doesn't realize. The lands he's seeking have been inhabited for thousands of years by sophisticated civilizations with their own explorers, their own maps, their own understanding of the world. And he's not even the first European to reach these shores. Norse sailors had established settlements in North America nearly 500 years earlier. You watch as Columbus makes entries in his journal each evening by lantern light, the ship creaking around him. These words will shape how generations understand this moment. There's no malice in his concentrated expression, just ambition and the certainty that what he's doing matters. When land finally appears on the horizon, the sailors fall to their knees in prayer. Columbus stands triumphantly at the bow, but as the small landing party rows toward shore, you notice something they seem to miss entirely. Smoke from cooking fires, paths worn through vegetation, gardens carefully tended, signs of home, not wilderness. You follow as Columbus plants the Spanish flag in the sand, claiming this new land for his patrons. The indigenous people who greet the strange visitors watch this ceremony with curiosity. How could they know that this symbolic act would be used to justify the erasure of their own claims to lands their ancestors had inhabited for centuries? The humid air carries unfamiliar scents, tropical flowers, cooking fires, the green abundance of forests that European eyes perceive as untamed wilderness, rather than carefully managed landscapes. Columbus writes of an Eden-like paradise, but misses the evidence of sophisticated agriculture all around him. In his interactions with the Taino people, you notice how Columbus focuses on what they lack by European standards: certain types of clothing, Christian faith, written language, rather than what they possess: deep botanical knowledge, sustainable agricultural practices, and oral traditions that preserve centuries of wisdom. You stand unnoticed as Columbus collects samples, plants, artifacts, even people, to bring back as evidence of his discovery. The irony is palpable. He didn't discover this land. He simply introduced it to a European audience that would reshape the narrative to center themselves. As the ships prepare to return to Spain, loaded with specimens and stories that will captivate Europe, you think about how Columbus will be remembered as the brave explorer who proved the world was round, though educated Europeans already knew this, and discovered a new world that was only new to them. The journey back across the Atlantic gives you time to reflect on how history is recorded. Columbus wasn't an exceptional navigator. He dramatically miscalculated the Earth's size. He wasn't the first European to reach the Americas. What made him exceptional was the timing of his voyage and who sponsored it: the powerful Spanish crown, poised for empire building. As Spain comes into view on the horizon, you can already imagine the parade that awaits, the stories that will grow with each telling, the maps that will be redrawn with Spanish names replacing indigenous ones. What you're witnessing isn't just exploration. It's the beginning of a massive historical reframing. The cool spring air of Seville fills your lungs as Columbus is welcomed home a hero. In the jubilant crowd, few question whether these lands were truly discovered. The narrative is already taking shape, and it's the narrative that will fill your childhood textbooks centuries later. Your journey takes you next to the spice-rich shores of India, where Portuguese ships under Vasco da Gama have just arrived in 1498. The air is thick with humidity and the aromas of cardamom, pepper, and cinnamon, scents that have drawn traders to these shores for thousands of years before any European sail appeared on the horizon. You watch as da Gama and his men disembark at Calicut, a bustling port city that had been trading with Arab, Chinese, and East African merchants for centuries. The Portuguese aren't discovering a hidden corner of the world. They're merely new players in an ancient commercial network. The local ruler, the Zamorin, receives these strange visitors with diplomatic courtesy, but also with the weary patience of someone who has entertained foreign traders for decades. Through interpreters, da Gama presents himself as an emissary of a powerful kingdom, but the gifts he offers, simple cloth and beads, reveal Europe's misunderstanding of its own position in the global hierarchy. You follow as the Portuguese are shown through the city's markets, where they gape at the abundance and sophistication that dwarfs anything in Europe. Merchants from dozens of kingdoms conduct business in multiple languages. Accounting systems track complex transactions. This isn't a primitive outpost awaiting European enlightenment. It's a cosmopolitan center of global trade. The scent of jasmine mingles with sea salt as you watch da Gama's growing frustration. He expected to find simple people eager for European goods and Christian conversion. Instead, he's confronted with a civilization that sees little value in what he has to offer and shows no interest in abandoning their own spiritual traditions. When local merchants politely decline the Portuguese trade offers, tension fills the air like the gathering monsoon clouds. Da Gama's expression darkens. This wasn't how the story was supposed to unfold. In the narrative he imagined, Europeans were bringers of civilization, not unwelcome newcomers struggling to gain a foothold. What happens next won't appear in most European accounts. Da Gama resorts to naval bombardment, using superior firepower to force trade terms when diplomacy fails. You feel the ground shake with each cannon blast, watch smoke rise from damaged docks, and realize how quickly exploration transforms into intimidation when the original script isn't followed. In the Portuguese records of this encounter, Calicut's reluctance to trade is portrayed as treachery, rather than the rational decision of an established commercial power. Da Gama will return to Portugal not as a failed diplomat, but as the hero who opened the sea route to India, a route that already existed, just not for Europeans. You stand in the shadow of a pepper warehouse as Portuguese sailors load their ships with the spices that will make their kingdom wealthy. The local dock workers exchange knowing glances. They've seen foreign powers come and go. Few realize that this particular arrival marks the beginning of a new kind of global relationship, one based not just on trade, but on the threat of force. As da Gama's ships prepare to depart, laden with pepper and misunderstandings, you contemplate how differently this encounter appears depending on where one stands. From Lisbon, it's a triumphant opening of trade routes. From Calicut, it's merely the arrival of yet another foreign power, albeit an unusually aggressive one. The sea breeze carries the scent of cloves as the Portuguese sails disappear over the horizon. You wonder how many other discoveries in history's pages were similar misrepresentations, moments when newcomers claimed to have found what locals had known all along. Your journey continues northward, to the frozen seas where Inuit people had been navigating the Arctic for thousands of years, before any European expedition arrived. The cold takes your breath away as you stand on ice, so thick it feels like stone beneath your feet. Your Inuit guide, dressed in perfectly designed furs, seems impervious to the temperature that makes your European-trained body shiver. How do you find your way when everything looks the same? You ask. gesturing at the seemingly featureless expanse of ice and snow that stretches to the horizon. Your guide smiles patiently and begins pointing out what you've failed to see: subtle variations in snow texture, the behavior of seabirds, changes in ice formations that signal transitions between land and sea. You're traveling in the early 1800s, when British naval expeditions are pushing into the Arctic, searching for the fabled Northwest Passage. These European explorers arrive with impressive ships, scientific instruments, and royal funding, yet they consistently struggle to survive in an environment where Inuit communities have thrived for generations. The silence of the Arctic is occasionally broken by the crunch of snow beneath your feet and the distant call of seabirds. Your guide stops to build a small shelter as a storm approaches, a structure made entirely of snow that will keep you warmer than any European tent could in these conditions. Inside the snow house, you watch as your companion starts a small fire using materials carried in a sealskin pouch. The space warms quickly, and as you remove your outer layer, you're struck by the ingenuity of Arctic technologies: clothing designed with air pockets for insulation, tools made from available materials, hunting techniques perfectly adapted to this environment. The howling wind outside contrasts with the surprising comfort within. Your guide shares dried fish and tells stories of ancestors who mapped these territories using oral traditions, creating mental cartographies that recorded every inlet, every hunting ground, every dangerous ice formation, maps carried in memory rather than on paper. When the storm passes, you continue your journey, eventually encountering a British expedition struggling to navigate the icy channels. Their massive ship looks absurdly out of place, a floating piece of England trapped in ice floes. The crew, despite their instruments and charts, is effectively lost. You watch as the expedition leader reluctantly hires local Inuit guides, whose knowledge they desperately need but whose expertise they consistently undervalue. In his journal, the British captain will describe being shown the way, without acknowledging that this way has been known to the Inuit for countless generations. The captain takes careful notes as your Inuit companion explains which routes remain open during different seasons, which areas harbor dangerous currents beneath the ice, where seal-breathing holes indicate safe passage. This knowledge will later appear in British Admiralty charts with no attribution to its source. When the expedition finally locates a navigable channel, the Union Jack is planted with ceremony. You stand at the periphery, watching as the British claim to have discovered a passage that Inuit hunters had used for centuries. In London, this moment will be celebrated as a triumph of British exploration, with no mention of the indigenous knowledge that made it possible. As you continue traveling with your Inuit guide, moving effortlessly across terrain that confounded European expeditions, you gain a new appreciation for different forms of expertise. The Inuit didn't need written maps because they possessed something more valuable: an intimate, lived understanding of this landscape, passed down through generations. The northern lights dance across the sky that night, painting the snow in ethereal greens and purples. Your guide points to patterns in the lights, explaining how they too can be read as navigational signs. You realize that exploration takes many forms, and that the most sophisticated technologies aren't always the ones made of metal and glass. Your journey sweeps you to another continent, where you find yourself in the lush heat of Central Africa in the late 19th century. You're traveling alongside a European expedition pushing into the Congo Basin, an area that colonial powers had deemed unexplored despite being home to complex kingdoms and trade networks for centuries. The humidity makes your clothing cling to your skin as you move through forests so dense it creates a green twilight at midday. The European explorers at the head of the column consult their maps and instruments frequently, while the dozens of African porters, guides, and translators, without whom this expedition would be impossible, receive barely a mention in the official records. You notice how the expedition leader takes detailed notes on everything he considers a discovery: plants, animals, geographic features, giving European names to things that already have local names in multiple languages. With each Latin classification, each entry in his journal, he is claiming not just physical territory but knowledge itself. The expedition stops at a village where they're welcomed with cautious hospitality. Through interpreters, the local leader explains that traders have been moving through this region for generations, that routes connect this community to others hundreds of miles away. But when the European explorer later writes his account, this village will be described as isolated and primitive. You watch as a local healer shows the expedition botanist plants with medicinal properties. The botanist collects specimens enthusiastically, recording their characteristics but not the generations of knowledge behind their use. These plants will eventually appear in European pharmacopoeias without acknowledgement of their origins. The sound of drums carries through the forest as the village celebrates a successful hunt. The European visitors observe with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, filtering everything through their own cultural preconceptions. In their journals, complex religious ceremonies will be reduced to superstition, sophisticated musical traditions to primitive rhythms. As the expedition continues its journey, you notice how completely it relies on local expertise. Guides who know which plants are poisonous, which trails are passable in the rainy season, how to navigate by landmarks in a landscape where European compasses are often confused by mineral deposits. Yet in the maps being drawn each evening by lamplight, this local knowledge is systematically erased. Rivers and mountains receive European names. Territories with centuries of human history are marked as uninhabited. The very people making the journey possible become invisible in its official record. You pause by a river crossing where the expedition is negotiating passage with a local kingdom. The African ruler, dressed in symbols of authority that the Europeans failed to recognize, clearly sees these visitors as merely the latest in a long history of foreigners passing through his territory. To him, they are not discoverers, but simply travelers in need of permission. The explorer, however, writes in his journal that he has discovered this kingdom, as if its existence began the moment European eyes beheld it. Back in London or Paris, this account will be read as evidence of heroic exploration rather than what it truly is, a profound misrepresentation of reality. As you travel deeper into the continent, following ancient trade routes that have connected African kingdoms for centuries, the gap between what you're witnessing and what will be recorded grows ever wider. It's not just a journey through space, but through competing versions of truth. The evening brings relief from the day's heat. Fireflies create constellations among the trees as the expedition makes camp. Tomorrow they will discover a river junction that local boatmen have navigated for generations. Another entry will be made in the official log. Another piece of Africa will be claimed, not just physically colonized, but narratively possessed. Your journey leaps across time and space once more, bringing you to the ancient civilizations of the Americas long before European contact. You stand in the central plaza of Tenochtitlan in the early 1500s, the Aztec capital that will leave Spanish conquistadors speechless with its grandeur when they arrive a few years later. The morning sun gleams off temples rising above a city more populous than any in Europe at the time. Markets bustle with goods from distant provinces. Aqueducts bring fresh water from miles away. This isn't a primitive settlement awaiting discovery. It's one of the world's great urban centers. The air carries the scent of maize, chili, and copal incense as you watch astronomers in a nearby temple observatory, tracking celestial movements with greater accuracy than their European counterparts. Their calendar system, recording time in cycles within cycles, reflects a mathematical sophistication that will be dismissed by conquistadors as mere superstition. You follow traders arriving from distant Maya territories, carrying goods along roads that have connected Mesoamerican civilizations for centuries. These weren't isolated peoples waiting to be found. They were participants in complex commercial and diplomatic networks spanning thousands of miles. In the Grand Library, scribes record historical events, astronomical observations, and literary works using writing systems that European invaders will later burn as demonic. These aren't people without history. They're people whose histories will be systematically erased and replaced. The afternoon heat brings a brief rain shower, and you notice how perfectly the city's drainage systems handle the water. Urban planning, architectural precision, hydraulic engineering, achievements that will be overlooked in European accounts that focus instead on aspects of Aztec culture that seem alien or threatening to Christian sensibilities. As evening approaches, you watch boats moving across Lake Texcoco, bringing goods from surrounding communities to the capital. This isn't wilderness. It's a carefully managed landscape where agriculture, urban development, and natural resources exist in careful balance. Yet future European maps will label much of this territory as untamed. You stand in the shadow of a temple as astronomers prepare to observe the night sky. Their understanding of Venus's movements rivals anything produced in European observatories. But when Spanish chronicles describe these practices, they will focus on human sacrifice while ignoring the intellectual achievements that European science won't match for decades. Night falls over the city, with torches illuminating streets laid out in precise geometric patterns. From a rooftop, you gaze at a metropolis that will, within a generation, be conquered, dismantled, and rebuilt as a Spanish capital. Most of its achievements will be literally buried, discovered centuries later by archaeologists who will marvel at what was lost. As stars appear overhead, the same stars being studied by the astronomers, you contemplate how completely the European narrative of discovery erased the scientific, architectural, and cultural achievements of civilizations like this one. It wasn't just land that was colonized, but history itself. The cool night air carries distant music as you consider what exploration truly meant in this context. When Cortés arrived, he wasn't finding unknown lands. He was entering a world with its own maps, its own explorers, its own understanding of geography. A world that had never been lost except to those who would later claim to have found it. Your journey continues to the ancient trade networks of West Africa in the 14th century, where you join a caravan crossing the Sahara. The pre-dawn air is crisp as travelers prepare to move before the day's heat makes passage unbearable. Camels snort and shift impatiently, loaded with goods that will connect African kingdoms to Mediterranean markets. You're traveling with merchants from the Mali Empire during its golden age, a time when this African superpower controlled trade routes spanning thousands of miles and maintained diplomatic relations with kingdoms across North Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. The sun rises over endless sand dunes, beginning its relentless ascent. Your companions move with practiced efficiency, reading the landscape for signs invisible to untrained eyes. Subtle changes in sand patterns, distant rock formations, the behavior of desert wildlife. This isn't uncharted territory. It's a highway of sorts, known intimately to those who traverse it regularly. You pass a series of stone markers carefully maintained to guide travelers along routes established centuries earlier. Your guide explains that these paths have connected the great trading cities of West Africa to North African ports since ancient times. Gold, salt, ivory, and ideas have flowed along these routes, creating networks of exchange long before Europeans began their age of exploration. The heat becomes oppressive by midday, and the caravan stops at an oasis where date palms provide blessed shade. The water tastes sweeter than any you've known, its value in this landscape impossible to overstate. Here, caravans have rested for generations, exchanging news and replenishing supplies. A merchant from Timbuktu shares dried fruits as he tells you about the famous libraries and universities of his city, institutions where scholars study mathematics, astronomy, literature, and law. In a few centuries, European accounts will describe Africa as a continent without history, yet you're listening to a man who can recite his city's scholarly lineage back hundreds of years. As the worst heat passes and the caravan prepares to continue its journey, you notice how the traders navigate using a combination of celestial observation, landmark recognition, and detailed knowledge passed down through generations of desert travelers. They don't need compasses or sextants to find their way across one of Earth's most challenging landscapes. The afternoon brings you to a trading post where merchants from different regions exchange goods and information. Multiple languages fill the air as transactions are recorded using numerical systems developed locally. These aren't simple barter exchanges, but sophisticated commercial interactions governed by complex customs and contracts. You watch as gold from the forests of West Africa is weighed and traded for salt from Saharan mines, a commerce that has helped build empires on both sides of the desert. When Europeans eventually reach these shores, they won't be discovering these trade networks. They'll be attempting to insert themselves into systems that have functioned efficiently for centuries. As night falls, bringing welcome relief from the heat, travelers gather around fires to share stories. An elderly griot, a keeper of oral history, recounts the lineage of kings and the journeys of past explorers who mapped the desert and forests long before any Europeans set foot on these lands. The stars overhead are extraordinary in their clarity, a celestial map that generations of travelers have used to navigate this vast terrain. Your companions point out constellations with names unfamiliar to you, explaining how their positions guide journeys across seemingly featureless expanses. Before sleeping, you contemplate how European narratives would later frame Africa as a dark continent awaiting discovery. Despite the illumination of scholarly traditions like those in Timbuktu, despite trade networks that connected diverse civilizations, despite indigenous explorers who had mapped territories Europeans wouldn't reach for centuries, the cool night air wraps around you as you drift toward sleep, understanding more deeply how exploration wasn't a European invention, but a human constant, one practiced with sophisticated methods by cultures that would later be portrayed as waiting in darkness for the light of discovery. Your journey takes you next to the shores of Australia, where you walk alongside Aboriginal guides in the time before European arrival. The early morning light catches on eucalyptus leaves, creating a silvery shimmer that contrasts with the red earth beneath your feet. The air carries the scent of plants found nowhere else on Earth, plants that your companions can name and explain in detail. This land doesn't belong to us, your guide tells you, gesturing to the landscape stretching toward distant hills. We belong to it. It's a fundamentally different relationship to place than the one that will arrive with European explorers. Not ownership, but kinship. Not discovery, but continuous revelation. You follow as your Aboriginal companions navigate using what Europeans would later dismiss as songlines, intricate oral maps combining geography, history, and spirituality. These aren't primitive substitutes for real maps, but sophisticated systems for transmitting precise knowledge across generations. The midday heat intensifies as you reach a water source that looks, to your untrained eye, like any other part of the seemingly harsh landscape. Your guides, however, move with certainty, knowing exactly where to dig to access the life-giving liquid hidden beneath the surface. This isn't luck. It's knowledge accumulated over 60,000 years of continuous habitation. You watch as they harvest plants with medicinal properties, explaining which part treats which ailment, when to collect it, how to prepare it. This botanical knowledge, developed through millennia of observation and experimentation, will later be discovered by European scientists who rarely acknowledge its source. The afternoon brings you to rock art that tells stories thousands of years old. Visual histories recording climate changes, animal migrations, human journeys. These aren't random drawings, but carefully maintained archives, regularly renewed to preserve information vital to survival and cultural continuity. Your guide points out subtle changes in vegetation that signal different soil types, different rainfall patterns, different ecological zones. This isn't wilderness to them. It's a thoroughly known landscape, categorized with precision that Western science won't match for centuries. As evening approaches, your companions prepare food using techniques perfectly adapted to local conditions. They aren't struggling to survive in a hostile environment. They're thriving in a homeland whose every feature they understand intimately, from seasonal changes in plant growth to the movement patterns of animals. The stars emerge in the clear desert sky, and your guide explains how they too tell stories. Stories that incorporate astronomical knowledge with practical guidance about when to move to new areas, when certain foods will be available, when weather patterns will change. By firelight, an elder shares creation stories that Europeans will later dismiss as myths, rather than recognizing them as complex systems for encoding environmental knowledge, ethical principles, and historical events. These aren't fairy tales, but sophisticated frameworks for understanding human relationships with land and community. As you prepare to sleep under the vast southern sky, you contemplate how completely European explorers will misunderstand what they're seeing when they arrive on these shores. They'll perceive emptiness where there is fullness, simplicity where there is complexity, wilderness where there is home. When British ships eventually claim to discover Australia, they'll declare it terra nullius, empty land, despite the presence of hundreds of distinct language groups, sophisticated knowledge systems, and one of humanity's oldest continuous cultures. It's perhaps the most profound erasure in the entire history of exploration. The cool night air carries the sound of distant dingoes as you drift toward sleep, understanding more deeply how exploration narratives don't just record journeys, they justify what comes after. The claiming, the renaming, the rewriting of histories that were never lost to those who lived them. Morning finds you in the Himalayan mountains, traveling with Sherpa guides long before European mountaineers arrived to conquer these peaks. The air is thin but exhilarating as you follow paths that have connected isolated valleys for centuries. Your companions move with practiced ease despite the challenging terrain and altitude that leaves you breathless. The rising sun turns distant snow-capped mountains gold, then blindingly white. Your Sherpa guide points out landmarks used for navigation through these seemingly impenetrable ranges, distinctive rock formations, glacial patterns, the specific shape of certain peaks. What looks chaotic to foreign eyes is thoroughly mapped in local knowledge. You stop at a small shrine decorated with prayer flags that flutter in the mountain breeze. Your companions explain that these pathways aren't just physical routes but spiritual journeys, each pass and peak having significance within a complex cosmology that Western climbers will later reduce to superstition. The day warms slightly as you traverse high meadows where yaks graze on specialized alpine plants. Your guide identifies herbs with medicinal properties, pointing out which can help with altitude sickness, which prevent frostbite, which aid digestion, knowledge that will later help European expeditions without receiving proper credit. You notice how perfectly adapted your companion's clothing is to this environment. Layers of wool and felt that insulate without restricting movement, boots designed for secure footing on varied terrain. These aren't primitive approximations of real gear, but technologies refined over generations of mountain living. At a high pass, you pause to catch your breath, astonished at how your Sherpa companions show no signs of the altitude sickness that makes your head pound. They explain their bodies have adapted over generations to thrive in this thin air, a physiological knowledge that future Western scientists will study but rarely attribute to its source. The afternoon brings you to a remote village nestled in a protected valley. Stone houses with intricate woodwork stand as testament to architectural traditions perfectly suited to local conditions, withstanding harsh winters, earthquakes, and avalanches through design principles developed over centuries. The scent of butter tea fills the air as villagers welcome travelers with practiced hospitality. This isn't an isolated community but a link in networks connecting Tibet, Nepal, and India. Trade routes through these seemingly impassable mountains have existed for as long as anyone can remember, moving goods and ideas across the roof of the world. You watch as local cartographers maintain detailed mental maps of the region, describing routes, conditions, and seasonal variations with precision that European surveyors won't match for centuries. These aren't people waiting to be found, but communities with their own explorers, their own geographic understandings, their own ways of navigating extreme landscapes. As evening falls, bringing mountain chill with it, villagers gather in the communal space. Stories are shared about ancestors who first mapped certain passes, who discovered hidden valleys, who established the routes that connect isolated communities. These aren't recorded in books but preserved in oral traditions with remarkable accuracy. The flickering butter lamps cast dancing shadows as an elder describes changes he's observed in glacial patterns over his lifetime. This isn't casual observation, but systematic tracking of environmental shifts, climate knowledge accumulated through generations of attentive relationship with the mountains. Before sleeping, wrapped in yak wool blankets against the penetrating cold, you reflect on how European mountaineers will later describe conquering these peaks, as if they were the first to map this terrain. They'll rename mountains that already have ancient names in local languages, claim first ascents on routes with long histories of indigenous use. The wind whispers around the stone walls as you drift toward sleep, understanding more deeply how exploration narratives reveal the perspective of their authors. The Himalayas will be portrayed as remote, forbidding, untouched, ignoring the generations who have made these mountains home, who have developed sophisticated knowledge of every slope and valley. Your journey continues to the vast expanses of the Arabian Desert in the 8th century, where you travel with Bedouin guides navigating by stars and subtle landscape features. The pre-dawn air carries a surprising chill as your companions prepare camels for the day's journey, their movements efficient from countless repetitions. The eastern horizon gradually lightens, revealing endless waves of sand stretching toward infinity. What looks like featureless terrain to your untrained eye contains countless signposts for those who know how to read them. Slight variations in sand color, the pattern of dunes, the presence of certain hardy plants. Your guide points to a distant rock formation barely visible in the growing light. We'll reach it by midday, he says with absolute certainty, though there's no obvious path, no trail markers, nothing that resembles a road. This isn't guesswork, but precise navigation based on generations of accumulated knowledge. As the sun climbs higher, bringing intense heat that seems to radiate from everything, you notice how perfectly adapted your companion's clothing is to this harsh environment. Loose layers that provide protection from both sun and occasional cold, head coverings that shield from heat while allowing airflow. You stop at what appears to be a random location, and your guides begin digging. Within minutes, they've reached moisture, a hidden water source known to their community for centuries. This isn't luck. It's detailed environmental knowledge passed down with life or death precision. The water tastes slightly mineralized but wonderfully refreshing. Your companions explain how these water sources connect, creating invisible networks across seemingly inhospitable terrain. Long before European explorers claimed to discover routes across these deserts, Bedouin traders had mapped complex pathways connecting distant oases. By midday, just as predicted, you reach the rock formation first spotted at dawn. In its shadow, travelers have rested for countless generations. Faint carvings in the stone record their passages, names, dates, messages to future travelers. This isn't uncharted wilderness, but a well-documented highway of sorts. You watch as your guides observe subtle wind patterns, explaining how they predict weather changes hours in advance. They describe navigating by star positions with precision that rivals any sextant. They identify plants with medicinal properties, animals whose behavior indicates nearby water, stones that mark ancient tribal boundaries. The afternoon heat becomes nearly unbearable, and conversation ceases as everyone conserves energy. You marvel at how your companions maintain their pace despite conditions that leave you dizzy and exhausted. This isn't simple physical endurance, but a complex set of adaptations, knowing when to move, when to rest, how much water to consume. As the sun finally begins its descent, bringing welcome relief, your guide points out a barely perceptible line of darker sand stretching toward the horizon. An ancient river, he explains. It still flows, but beneath the surface. This knowledge of hidden hydrology, developed through centuries of careful observation, will later be discovered by Western geologists using ground-penetrating radar. Evening brings dramatic temperature drops, and your companions efficiently establish camp, knowing exactly which depressions in the landscape offer protection from night winds. A small fire provides warmth as they share bread baked directly in the embers. This isn't survival. It's mastery of an environment that outsiders perceive as alien and hostile. Under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seem close enough to touch, your guide points out celestial patterns used for navigation across the desert. These aren't just pretty lights, but critical tools. A map written in the heavens that has guided travelers for millennia. Before sleeping, wrapped in woolen blankets against the surprising desert cold, you listen as stories are shared about ancestors who first mapped certain routes, who discovered hidden oases, who established trading connections across vast distances. These oral histories aren't vague legends, but precise geographical records maintained across generations. The distant howl of a desert fox punctuates the night as you drift toward sleep, understanding more deeply how exploration has always been a human constant, not the exclusive domain of those who wrote the history books, but the practice of communities adapting to and mapping their environments across time. Your journey takes you to the lush rainforests of the Amazon basin in the 15th century, before European arrival. The dawn chorus of birds and insects creates a symphony unlike anything you've heard before. Thousands of species announcing the new day in a cacophony that somehow forms its own harmony. You're traveling with indigenous guides from one of the hundreds of distinct cultures that call this vast forest home. The humidity wraps around you like a warm blanket as you follow barely perceptible paths through vegetation so dense it creates a green twilight even at midday. Your companions move with complete confidence through what outsiders would perceive as trackless wilderness. They point out subtle trail markers, a bent twig here, a particular arrangement of leaves there, that create an invisible but precise network of roots connecting distant communities. The air is rich with unfamiliar scents, flowering plants, decomposing vegetation, the distinctive musk of animals you never see but whose presence your guides track with casual expertise. This isn't an untamed jungle, but a thoroughly known landscape, mapped through generations of careful observation. You stop to rest near a grove of trees that appear identical to others you've passed. Your guide explains that this specific location is maintained for its medicinal plants, that certain trees are cultivated for their fruits or saps, that what looks like random growth is actually the result of centuries of human interaction with the forest. The rain begins suddenly, a vertical river that drenches everything within seconds. Your companions quickly construct a temporary shelter using broad leaves and flexible vines, demonstrating architectural knowledge perfectly adapted to local conditions and materials. Within minutes, you're dry while water streams all around you. When the downpour subsides, leaving the forest dripping and even more vibrantly green, your journey continues. Your guide points out plants with specific properties, one whose sap heals wounds, another whose leaves reduce fever, a third whose bark, when prepared properly, relieves pain. This isn't random knowledge, but a sophisticated pharmacopoeia developed through centuries of careful experimentation. You reach a river where canoes have been cached for travelers. The craft appear simple but prove remarkably stable and maneuverable in the complex currents. These aren't primitive approximations of real boats, but technologies perfectly designed for these specific waterways. As you travel downstream, your companions identify fish species beneath the surface, describing which are good to eat, which have special cultural significance, which indicate healthy water conditions. This isn't casual observation, but detailed ecological knowledge maintained across generations. The afternoon brings you to a community where gardens are integrated so perfectly with the surrounding forest that an outsider might miss them entirely. This isn't primitive agriculture, but sophisticated agroforestry, cultivating multiple species in relationships that maintain soil fertility without clearing large areas. You watch as community members harvest plants, explaining which parts are used, when they should be collected, how they should be prepared. This botanical knowledge, developed through millennia of observation and experimentation, will later be discovered by Western scientists who rarely acknowledge its source. As evening approaches, your host demonstrates how certain soils are modified with charcoal and organic matter to create terra preta, incredibly fertile black earth that remains productive for centuries. This ancient agricultural technology, predating European arrival by thousands of years, will be discovered by Western researchers in the 20th century. The night brings a community gathering where oral histories are shared, stories that encode geographical knowledge, ecological relationships, astronomical observations. These aren't quaint myths, but sophisticated systems for transmitting critical information across generations without written language. Under the partial canopy of stars visible through the forest cover, your host explains how celestial patterns guide planting cycles, migration timing, and seasonal activities. This isn't primitive superstition, but practical astronomy, developed through centuries of systematic observation. As you prepare to sleep in a hammock perfectly designed for the forest environment, you reflect on how European explorers will later describe this region as untamed wilderness, ignoring the sophisticated ecological management, the extensive trail networks, the complex knowledge systems developed by those who have made this forest home for millennia. The night sounds of the rainforest, a biological symphony of extraordinary complexity, lull you toward sleep as you understand more deeply how the concept of discovery depends entirely on whose knowledge counts, whose histories are recorded, whose maps are considered real. Your journey spans to the vast oceans of the Pacific, where you sail with Polynesian navigators using traditional methods that enabled them to explore and settle islands across distances that would astonish European sailors. The pre-dawn air carries the scent of salt and possibility as you board a double-hulled voyaging canoe designed for long-distance travel. The eastern sky gradually lightens, revealing an endless horizon where sea meets sky in a perfect line. There's no land visible in any direction, no landmarks, nothing that resembles a path. Yet your navigator speaks with quiet confidence about the island destination days away, though he carries no charts, no compass, no sextant. As the sun rises fully, casting golden light across gentle swells, you observe how the navigator reads the ocean itself, the pattern of waves reflecting off distant islands too far to see, the behavior of certain birds that never venture far from land, the specific color of clouds forming over unseen destinations. The ocean doesn't separate islands, your companion explains, echoing words you heard earlier in your journey. It connects them. This perspective, seeing vast water expanses not as barriers but as highways, enabled Pacific peoples to explore and settle an area larger than continental Europe, centuries before European ships ventured beyond coastal waters. The voyaging canoe moves with surprising speed and stability, its design refined through generations of open ocean travel. This isn't a primitive craft, but a sophisticated vessel perfectly adapted to Pacific conditions, able to sail close to the wind, carry substantial provisions and weather storms that would threaten much larger ships. You watch as the navigator observes subtle changes in ocean swells, explaining how they reveal the presence of land beyond the horizon. He points out star paths that will rise in specific positions to guide the night journey. He notes the flight patterns of birds returning to distant islands in the evening. None of this is recorded on paper, but all of it is precisely mapped in memory and oral tradition. The day passes with the rhythmic motion of the ocean beneath you. The crew works with practiced efficiency, adjusting sails, distributing weight, maintaining their course through methods invisible to untrained eyes. This isn't luck or approximation, but navigation of extraordinary precision, allowing them to find tiny islands across thousands of miles of open water. As the sun begins its descent, your navigator points to patterns in the waves that have shifted subtly. "We're in the sea road to Rarotonga now," he explains, referring to influences on wave patterns created by an island still far beyond the horizon. This isn't mysticism, but practical physics, understanding how islands interrupt ocean swells in ways that can be detected at great distances. The night brings a spectacular canopy of stars, and your companion begins naming star paths and celestial reference points used to maintain course through darkness. This isn't decorative knowledge, but critical navigation information, a map written in the heavens that has guided voyagers for centuries. You learn that these navigators can name hundreds of stars, describing their positions throughout the year with accuracy that rivals any astronomical chart. They track subtle variations in ocean currents, cloud formations, bird migrations, and seasonal winds, creating comprehensive mental maps of a seemingly featureless environment. The gentle rocking of the canoe continues through the night as navigators take turns watching the stars, maintaining course with extraordinary precision without instruments. This isn't primitive approximation, but sophisticated wayfinding, allowing Pacific peoples to discover and settle islands across distances that European sailors wouldn't traverse for centuries. Before sleeping on the platform between the canoe hulls, watching stars wheel overhead, you reflect on how European explorers will later claim to discover Pacific islands that have been settled for generations, inhabited by people who navigated there using methods more sophisticated than anything available to early European sailors. The rhythmic sound of water against the hulls lulls you toward sleep, as you understand more deeply how exploration narratives reveal the biases of their authors. The vast Pacific, portrayed in European accounts as an empty, threatening void finally mastered by Western technology, was in fact a thoroughly mapped highway system for those who had developed the knowledge to read its signs. Your journey continues to the great maritime civilizations of Southeast Asia in the 14th century, where you board a massive trading vessel belonging to the maritime kingdom of Srivijaya. The harbor bustles with activity as dawn breaks over waters that have connected China, India, and the Middle East through complex trade networks for centuries. The ship dwarfs anything sailing in European waters at this time, a 9-masted colossus capable of carrying hundreds of sailors and merchants along with vast cargoes. This isn't primitive transportation, but cutting-edge maritime technology, featuring watertight compartments, balanced rudders, and sophisticated sail systems that European shipbuilders won't develop for centuries. As the vessel moves into open water with the morning tide, you observe the captain consulting navigational charts that map seasonal winds, ocean currents, and star positions with remarkable precision. These aren't crude approximations, but detailed technical documents reflecting generations of systematic observation and record-keeping. The crew works with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role within a complex operational hierarchy. This isn't chaotic effort, but professional seamanship, the product of formal training systems and institutional knowledge developed across generations of maritime commerce. You watch as the navigator uses multiple methods to determine position: celestial observations, depth soundings, recognition of submarine features, and knowledge of sea conditions specific to different regions. This isn't guesswork, but precise science, allowing these vessels to maintain established routes connecting ports thousands of miles apart. By midday, the coastline has disappeared and the ship continues confidently into open water. The captain explains trade routes that have connected China to East Africa for centuries, long before European vessels would venture beyond sight of land. These weren't accidental discoveries, but established commercial highways maintained through sophisticated navigation and shipbuilding traditions. You observe how cargo is carefully distributed to maintain stability in different sea conditions, how provisions are stored to prevent spoilage on voyages lasting months, how fresh water is preserved through ingenious systems. This isn't primitive transport, but advanced logistics, solving complex problems of long-distance maritime travel. The afternoon brings you into busier shipping lanes where vessels from different regions exchange signals and information. This isn't isolated exploration, but a coordinated network, ships sharing knowledge about weather patterns, pirate activity, and market conditions in distant ports. As evening approaches, the navigator demonstrates methods for determining position using stars unfamiliar to European astronomy. These aren't random observations, but systematic celestial mapping, creating reliable references for maintaining course through darkness. The night watch begins with careful attention to wind patterns that might signal changing weather. The pilot explains how subtle shifts in air temperature, cloud formations, and wave characteristics provide early warning of conditions that might endanger the vessel. This isn't superstition, but practical meteorology, developed through centuries of careful observation. Before sleeping in the surprisingly comfortable merchant quarters, you reflect on how European narratives will later portray their own maritime technologies as uniquely advanced, ignoring or minimizing the sophisticated shipbuilding, navigation, and trading systems that had connected Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa for centuries before European vessels entered these waters. The gentle rocking of the massive ship lulls you toward sleep as you understand more deeply how exploration narratives often serve to justify power, portraying as discoveries places and routes that were already thoroughly known, just not to Europeans. Your journey carries you back to the Andes Mountains, where you travel with indigenous guides along ancient road networks that connected the vast Inca Empire. The thin mountain air fills your lungs as dawn illuminates stone-paved paths stretching toward distant peaks. These aren't rough trails, but engineered highways, some stretching for thousands of miles across some of Earth's most challenging terrain. Your guide points out architectural features that make these roads extraordinary: drainage systems preventing erosion, retaining walls supporting paths along sheer cliffs, stone steps cutting through otherwise impassable terrain. This isn't primitive construction, but sophisticated civil engineering that will still be functioning centuries after the empire's fall. As the morning progresses, you reach a way station where travelers could rest and resupply. These facilities, positioned a day's journey apart along major routes, represent systematic infrastructure supporting exploration, trade, and imperial administration across a territory larger than any contemporary European state. You observe how the roads follow optimal routes through extreme landscapes, switchbacks reducing the steepness of climbs, tunnels cutting through ridges, bridges spanning gorges. This isn't random pathfinding, but deliberate design, creating transportation networks that connected coastal regions, high plateaus, and Amazonian lowlands. At midday, you encounter relay runners transferring messages across vast distances with extraordinary speed. This communication system, allowing information to travel hundreds of miles in days, enabled coordination across an empire spanning multiple climate zones and ecological regions. European kingdoms had nothing comparable. The afternoon brings you to magnificent agricultural terraces, carved into seemingly impossible slopes. Your guide explains how these engineered landscapes, transforming steep mountains into productive farmland, represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about soil management, irrigation, and microclimate manipulation. You learn how Inca engineers studied weather patterns, water sources, and soil conditions before designing these systems. This wasn't primitive farming, but sophisticated environmental science, creating sustainable agriculture in one of the world's most challenging landscapes. As evening approaches, you reach a community where travelers are provided food and shelter as part of imperial infrastructure. Your host explains how the extensive road network facilitated not just military movement and administrative control, but exploration, allowing systematic knowledge gathering about diverse territories and resources. You observe how travelers record information about conditions in different regions, resources available, population centers, and potential threats. This isn't casual observation but organized intelligence, feeding into imperial knowledge systems that mapped and monitored a territory spanning modern Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and parts of Colombia, Argentina, and Chile. Before sleeping in the community guest quarters, you hear stories of how Inca explorers mapped territories from coastal deserts to Amazonian rainforests, developing detailed understanding of diverse ecosystems and how to sustainably manage them. These weren't random wanderings but systematic exploration, extending imperial knowledge across extraordinary environmental diversity. The mountain cold settles as you drift toward sleep, understanding more deeply how European accounts would later portray these same landscapes as wilderness, requiring Western exploration and development, erasing the sophisticated indigenous knowledge systems, infrastructure networks, and environmental management that had shaped these territories for centuries. The distant sound of wind through mountain passes accompanies your thoughts as you reflect on how completely the narrative of discovery depends on whose knowledge counts, whose maps are recognized, whose histories are preserved. Your final journey brings you to the present day, where you find yourself in a modern university library. Sunlight streams through tall windows, illuminating shelves filled with exploration narratives, books celebrating the great discoverers who supposedly revealed the world to European eyes. You pick up a volume about Columbus, noticing how it portrays him as a visionary who proved the world was round, though educated Europeans already knew this, and discovered a new world that was only new to them. The familiar story unfolds on gilded pages, with little mention of the sophisticated civilizations already thriving in these supposedly found lands. Moving through the stacks, you find histories of Arctic exploration that minimize or entirely omit the Inuit guides, without whom European expeditions would have perished. The Western explorers are portrayed as heroes, battling an untamed wilderness, rather than newcomers relying on indigenous knowledge to survive in a homeland others had successfully inhabited for millennia. In the cartography section, beautifully reproduced antique maps show Africa labeled as Dark Continent well into the 19th century, ignoring the complex kingdoms, trade networks, and indigenous geographical knowledge that had mapped these territories centuries before European arrival. A glossy coffee table book about the discovery of Pacific Islands makes barely a mention of the extraordinary navigational achievements that allowed Polynesian peoples to find and settle these same islands hundreds of years earlier, using methods more sophisticated than anything available to the Europeans who claimed to have found them. As afternoon light shifts through the windows, you browse scholarly works on the Amazon basin that describe 20th century discoveries of agricultural and ecological management techniques that indigenous communities had developed and maintained for thousands of years before European arrival. You notice how consistently these narratives center European perspectives, portraying as heroic firsts what were merely initial European encounters with places, peoples, and knowledge systems that had existed for centuries or millennia. It's not just historical oversight, it's a fundamental reframing that erases indigenous achievement. The library begins to empty as evening approaches, and you find yourself reflecting on your journey through alternative histories of exploration. You've witnessed how the familiar narratives taught in schools represent not objective accounts, but carefully constructed stories that serve to justify colonization, resource extraction, and cultural domination. You realize that what we call the age of exploration might better be understood as an age of encounter, moments when different knowledge systems, different maps, different understandings of the world came into contact, often with devastating consequences for those whose knowledge was systematically devalued and erased. As you prepare to leave the library, you pause by a display of modern satellite maps, our contemporary understanding of the world rendered in perfect digital detail. Even these seemingly objective representations, you now understand, contain implicit values and perspectives, choices about what to highlight and what to obscure. The quiet hum of the library's climate control system accompanies your thoughts as you consider how deeply exploration narratives have shaped not just our understanding of history, but our sense of who creates knowledge, whose discoveries matter, whose maps count as real. You step outside into the evening air, seeing the world differently than when your journey began. The familiar streets of your neighborhood now prompt questions about what was here before, whose knowledge of this place has been preserved or erased, whose explorations have been celebrated or forgotten. The stars begin to appear overhead, the same stars that guided Polynesian navigators across vast oceans, that showed Arctic peoples the changing seasons, that helped desert nomads find their way across seemingly featureless landscapes. These celestial maps connected human communities to place long before the great explorers claimed to discover worlds that were never truly lost. Your journey has revealed that exploration isn't the exclusive domain of those who wrote the history books or whose names adorn monuments. It's a fundamentally human activity, the careful, curious mapping of environment through accumulated observation and experience, practiced by communities across time and space. The greatest illusion wasn't in what these explorers found, but in what their stories hid. The sophisticated knowledge systems, the complex technologies, the profound achievements of cultures whose expertise was systematically erased from the narrative of how humanity came to know the world. As you make your way home through familiar streets now seen with new eyes, you carry with you not just a more accurate understanding of history, but a more humble appreciation for the multiple ways of knowing that have always shaped human relationship with place. The questions linger like companions. Whose knowledge counts? Whose discoveries matter? Whose maps are remembered? And perhaps most importantly, how might we begin to redraw these stories to honor the full complexity of human exploration across time? The journey changes you, as all true explorations must. You find yourself listening differently, questioning reflexive certainties, looking beyond familiar narratives for the untold stories that might reveal a more complete truth. This too is exploration, the mapping not just of physical territory but of understanding itself. And perhaps that's the most valuable lesson of your journey through hidden histories, that the world wasn't discovered once, in a single heroic age of European expansion, but has been continuously revealed through countless acts of careful observation, systematic knowledge building, and profound connection to place practiced by human communities across millennia. The true age of exploration never ended. It continues whenever we approach the world with humility, recognizing that our maps, literal and metaphorical, are always incomplete, always reflecting particular perspectives, always capable of being redrawn to include what has been erased. This understanding doesn't diminish human achievement, it expands it, acknowledging the extraordinary diversity of ways people have explored, mapped, and made meaning of their environments across time and space. It reminds us that knowledge isn't the property of any single tradition, but the collective inheritance of humanity. As night fully arrives and the familiar constellations wheel overhead, you understand that redrawing these narratives isn't just about correcting historical inaccuracies. It's about recognizing how stories of exploration continue to shape our present, influencing who we see as knowledge creators, whose expertise we value, whose achievements we celebrate. The gentle evening breeze carries hints of seasons changing, reminding you that the world reveals itself differently depending on how closely we attend to it, what questions we ask, what knowledge we're willing to recognize. This too is exploration, not the conquering of unknown territory, but the continuous, humble discovery of what has always been present, but not always seen. And that perhaps is the journey that matters most. Not across oceans or mountains, but across the boundaries of our own understanding, beyond the familiar maps that have limited what we recognize as knowledge, toward a more complete appreciation of how humanity has always explored, always mapped, always sought to understand this extraordinary world we share. If this journey through the untold side of exploration made you rethink what you learned in school, or at least made you grateful for modern plumbing, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories that peel back the shiny layer of history to reveal the chaos, courage, and questionable choices underneath, subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and tell me, which explorer would you never trust with directions, even on Google Maps? Thanks for sailing with me, and remember, not all who wander are lost, but some definitely should have brought a better map.